Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Claudia Avilas, and I'm the program manager based in New York City here with the Coalition for College. We are in a Zoom meeting space today, and this session is being recorded so that we can provide the recording to you in a resources folder that we put together. To get us started today, we'll have a couple questions that our presenters will answer, and then we will open up to Q&A from all of you. During the Q&A portion of the call, please feel free to chat in your questions as they come up. And you could also unmute yourself if you would like to read your question aloud. I'm joined today by my colleague, Derek Terrell, who is also serving as the chat moderator. He's going to be sharing some links in the chat, such as the resources folder, the attendance form, and other links. So keep your eye on the chat for that. Before we get started with the session today, I do want to tell you a little bit about the Coalition for College and who we are. So the Coalition is more than 170 colleges and universities with the proven commitment to access, affordability, and student success. As a group, we work together to help students learn about, prepare for, and apply to college. We believe that coalition schools are smart college choices because they not only provide responsible financial aid, but they also graduate students in a timely manner, including students who have been historically underrepresented in higher education. Students at our member schools are successful regardless of the size or the selectivity of the school. Coalition members are committed to access, providing responsible financial support for students and support to help students graduate in a timely manner. And most importantly, our students are succeeding. As a collective, you can see that coalition schools outperform the national averages by about 17% when it comes to graduation rates. And this is an important factor for students to consider when you think about the time and the money that students will be investing in their education. So when thinking about where students can apply, a great place to start that search and helping students build their list is by exploring the over 170 coalition schools that are dedicated to making a college education both accessible and affordable. The coalition and its members work to help students learn about, prepare for, and apply to college. And as we learn more about any updates related to the new FAFSA, we will make sure to keep folks up to date. Make sure you follow us on Instagram. We have our handle so that you can see. And I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge the challenges that folks may be having as you're trying to support students and families in filling out their FAFSA. Although we may not have all the answers for you today, we do hope that this session will help answer questions that you may have based on what we know now. And as more information and updates are made to the FAFSA, we'll make sure to update people. So again, you can feel free to follow us on social media. And if you have any questions after this session, feel free to reach out to us via email at info@coalitionforcollege.org. And we have some upcoming spring events that we're doing, and we are going to be sharing some links in the chat with you all so that you can register or you can share the information with your students and families to register for these upcoming events. And now I'm going to allow our incredible coalition member representatives introduce themselves. I'm joined today by members from Mount Holyoke and Stony Brook University. So if I could have our panelists tell us their name, their title, and how long they've been working in higher ed or financial aid.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Taylor Kruder. I'm the Executive Director of Student Financial Services at Mount Holyoke College. So that's just a fancy way of saying I oversee financial aid student accounts and student employment on campus. I've been in the industry just about 10 years now, so happy to be here with you this morning.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Nick Pruitt. I'm the Director of Financial Aid at Stony Brook University on Long Island.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we'll go ahead and get into some questions. We have a couple, but again, the purpose of today's session is to provide this space for you to ask any questions that you may have about the FAFSA. So the first question that we have here is, this year the FAFSA did change. Can someone speak to why these changes happened in the first place?
I can go ahead and get us started. It's a little bit funny when we say that it changed because of the simplification initiative that we wanted to embark on, and that Congress with the FAFSA Simplification Act has put forward as a law. So the overall idea is that the changes that were made or are being made currently are to simplify things for families, right? So the notion started that they want families to be able to really quickly figure out what they're eligible for in federal aid. The process that we're all experiencing right now, we know is not a simplified version of what we've experienced, but the idea is once that we get through this and the technological things behind the scenes, that families will have a much more accurate view and an easier path forward as to understanding what they are eligible for.
Thank you. And the next question, could you highlight some of those key changes to the FAFSA that might be important to keep in mind? What are some of those big changes?
Yeah, I can take this one. I think one of the goals of the making changes to the FAFSA process was to make it simpler. And they've actually entitled it FAFSA simplification. And so the big piece is that when a parent or a student logs in to complete the FAFSA, they will log in, they will create their information, and the data exchange with the IRS is seamless and automatic to populate the information. So years ago, when you completed the FAFSA, you needed your tax return information. Most recently, you could do what was called the IRS data exchange, where you could log in. It would direct you to the IRS website. You could transfer over the information. The new system is mainly designed to automatically import that information directly into the FAFSA. And I think that is really one of the biggest key changes. Some of the formulas behind the scenes have also had a slight impact. And the goal is to increase the number of students that are eligible for federal need-based aid programs, specifically the Pell Grant program. And so at Stony Brook, as we kind of have used some of the tools to identify our population, we'll see our population of Pell eligible students from in-state New York increase from 40 to 50%. And a lot of schools are kind of seeing that trend where more students are becoming eligible. The FAFSA is also a little bit simpler. They cut a number of questions out. Some of those were to the benefit of the students. Some of those caused some problems at the schools. But the goal is to have students answer only the questions that they need to answer so that we working in the financial aid office can actually award and package financial aid.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. And again, we kind of just prepared a couple questions, but we do want to focus on giving our counselors and advisors the space. What are some questions that you would like to ask Nick and Taylor, who both work in financial aid? What are some things that they can answer for you today? Okay, so I see one question coming in through the chat. It says, when will colleges be getting the FAFSA data?
Hey, I think that would be the question that I would love to answer today. And I think we as schools really want to have that. So for those that have been kind of following, the FAFSA was to become available in December. The FAFSA became available on December 31st for a couple of hours to meet the requirements by Congress. At that time, they told us that FAFSA data would be to us by the end of January. And so that's going to be Wednesday. We do not expect really to receive the FAFSA data by Wednesday. And that's because when the Department of Education put together the FAFSA process, they did not update the income protection tables or the asset protection tables for the most recent inflation index. So this means that the FAFSA data is slightly off, mainly for students that would fall in that lower amount of Pell Grant eligibility. The department estimates that change will result in $1.8 billion of aid going out to students. So right now, we could probably give you an estimate. It's supposed to be out by the end of January, but the Department of Education has not released an updated timeline. At our school, we're saying maybe we can get it by February 15th, maybe by the end of February, but those are really just guesses at this time.
Thank you so much, Nick. We have another question here. By mistake, a student clicked yes on the apply for direct unsubsidized loan only, and the form was submitted. It seems by accident. What can be done if the student made a mistake on their FAFSA? I'll throw this one to Taylor, and if Taylor,
Yeah.
you're not sure, we can go to Nick.
Thanks. You can do a couple of different things. I would recommend at this point, just waiting and in receiving your financial aid offers from your institutions. Most institutions will still package you with a subsidized loan if you're eligible for it, since that is the most beneficial thing for the student. At this point, I would not try to submit a FAFSA correction or anything like that, just because of the delay in the process and how rigorous that is right now. If your students are extra concerned, they can email each aid office if they want to make sure it's noted in their file. But I would advise a student who is, a prospective student at Mount Holyoke to just wait. We would package with a subsidized loan regardless.
Thank you. The next question we have here is students with parents who have parents who are undocumented are having trouble completing their FAFSAs due to the Social Security number situation. Is there any advice that you could provide on how to navigate this situation?
Yeah, so we're hearing from that from a number of students as well. We've done a couple of community nights, and our most recent one, the way I would divide it up, is about 70% of our students didn't really have any troubles. About 30% we had to work with very diligently, and about half of that, so let's say 15% of the population, they were unable to submit the FAFSA. And what it really came down to were parents who were having difficulty either with their Social Security number or with the Social Security match. The FAFSA process is now set up that everyone who completes the FAFSA process is required to have a federal student aid ID. To complete that federal student aid ID, you either need a Social Security number or you need to be able to answer a few key questions. My biggest tip is that process runs through TransUnion. So if you've ever kind of done the challenge questions, maybe when you're trying to pull a free copy of your credit report or anything like that, what loans maybe do you have or what addresses have you lived at? Our biggest advice so far that we've shared with families is make sure you're very confident in those answers, because you get one shot at answering them. And if they're not correct, then the information won't be uploaded into the system. At that point, you would have to kind of more go down that paper route of completing the FAFSA. And I'll be honest, as a financial aid person, we're still not really sure what the end process of that paper route is going to look like. And so we're really stressing to students and parents to make sure that they're completing it on their own, they're completing it online, and to take their time when it comes to any challenge type questions. That's the biggest tip that we would have there.
Thank you, Nick. We have another question that was submitted regarding what to do with students whose parents are no longer employed, but were employed in 2022. So a financial situation changing. How would you advise this student and family? And Taylor, I'll throw this one to you.
Sure. So this is what aid administrators refer to as professional judgment or a financial aid appeal. A lot of different schools will call it a lot of different things, but what the key is here is that you should be advising your students to continue filing with the tax year that is on record, which for incoming fall 2024 students, it's the tax year 2022. Because of the way the FAFSA is collecting that information now, it's really hard because you have to sync it with the IRS and those tax years. And so what they need to do then is begin the process of appealing at each institution that they're interested in. When I talk to families and students about this process and they're still trying to decide between more than one institution, it's really important that you advise your students to fill out the appropriate documentation at each school, which will look and feel different for each institution. And when the appeal is reviewed by those schools, the student and family should be preparing themselves for very different results from each of those different institutions, right? So at that point, it's the institution's ability to choose whether or not they're going to approve the appeal based on their own institutional policies and things like that. This will differ for schools that are FAFSA only versus CSS profile schools as well, which I know we have a couple questions in there about those schools. So it's just a reminder that you have to use the tax year that they're asking for and then pursue an appeal with every individual school that that student is still interested in.
And just to ask a follow-up question, could you describe like what the appeal looks like? Should email, is phone call, what does that process look like?
Yeah, so I always encourage families to reach out in the modality that is best for them. So if you know your families work best on a phone call or they learn best in a phone call, encourage them to call. If they're a really tech savvy family and they just like email, email is fine too. I know a lot of aid administrators always prefer to have a conversation, whether over Zoom or on the phone with the family, because we will ask a lot of questions about that family's financial circumstances, because we want to know the whole picture, not just what you think you may appeal based on, because we have latitude in more areas than what families might think going into this process. So my rule of thumb with families is you can't share too much information with me, even if you find it irrelevant, we may not. And so we'll ask a lot of fact-finding questions there. In Mount Holyoke, we have a form that you'll fill out. We'll ask what your current income looks like. Schools are really used to these conversations because it's using 2 years ago tax information. We know there are so many families who are experiencing something really different financially right now than what they were 2 years ago. And so always just pick up the phone and call or shoot us an email, and those schools will get back to you about their individual processes.
Thank you so much, Taylor, for elaborating on that. The next question we have here is, with FAFSA's change, no longer acknowledging the multiple students in the same household being in college, will this affect the amount of support that students will receive? And Nick, I'll throw this one to you.
Yeah, so this is one of the changes that occurred in the new FAFSA process. Originally, when a student completed the FAFSA, it asked how many people were in their household and how many people were in college. What happened behind the scenes was there was something called a student contribution from the student income and assets, and the parental contribution from the parent income and assets. And if a family had more than one student in college, that parental contribution was then divided by the number of students that were in college. That question went away in the FAFSA, and the calculations behind the scenes changed. And so some families will be impacted by that. At our institution, it's 0.7% of students kind of fell into that category. We're still at the point as an institution of trying to, well, one, we need the FAFSA information to come in, so that hasn't occurred yet. And two, we really want to try to do our best to hold some of those students harmless, but we really need to be able to look at the data. And so right now as an institution, we will not be making adjustments to that. We'll be following the Department of Education's kind of FAFSA process. What we may end up doing as an institution, if we are able to identify the students, let's say a student was a sophomore, junior, or senior, and they were Pell Grant eligible and this knocks them out of that range, we may have the opportunity to offer some institutional funds to those students. I'm not sure if it'll be a dollar for dollar amount or if we'll add an extra award. And so what I would say is a lot of institutions are pursuing that as an avenue. There are some institutions that are saying, nope, we're just going to follow the FAFSA as it's written. So I tell you that we have sort of a plan, but we haven't really said that that's fully what we're going to do as an institution yet. And I think a lot of institutions are going to fall into that. So the way I would answer this is more kind of a wait and see kind of approach. But like I said, 0.7% of our students, which is a very small number, were actually impacted in what their aid eligibility ultimately would be.
Thank you so much, Nick.
Claudia, is it helpful if I jump in and chat about the CSS profile schools right now?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. So some institutions, I'm sure you all are aware, collect the CSS profile and then use iDoc, which is a document processing center for tax returns and things like that. For most schools who continue to use CSS profile, the number of siblings in college and where they attend is still accurately captured on the CSS profile, and institutions are still choosing to use that as part of the contribution for the student and family. What that means is that there may be instances in which at CSS profile schools, you're receiving a lower contribution or calculation than you would with the FAFSA because we're accounting for multiple siblings in college. Before this year, that was never typically the case. A CSS profile calculated contribution would almost always be higher than the information the FAFSA is collected. This year, you can probably start to see when your students start bringing you aid offers to review, the contributions from schools that collect CSS profile may actually be lower in some instances because we're still collecting that information and using that.
Thank you, Taylor. And in regard to just speaking about the CSS profile, I see that a question did come in about it. How will the new FAFSA impact schools that require the CSS profile?
So for us here at Mount Holyoke, it's actually not impacting us negatively right now. Knock on wood, I say that out loud in front of all of you, and I hope that doesn't change. What we're doing is we're choosing to read all of our financial aid applications without the FAFSA. We have a way of estimating the federal aid that those students will receive. Because we collect the CSS profile and all of their tax returns, we have all the information we would need to be able to evaluate and do needs analysis on the family. And so we're able to move through our process the same that we have been able to move through our process. There are schools that I work with that also collect the CSS profile that have chosen that we will not even review FAFSAs from students until after May 1 because of how confident we are in the needs analysis and calculations that we're putting forward from the CSS profile and tax returns. And so still encourage you to have your students reach out to schools that collect both to make sure what the deadlines are and that they're following them. But it's really hard for institutions to say we have a deadline when the students have submitted it and they have confirmation, but schools have no line of sight to that confirmation. So.
Thank you, Taylor. And I know that we have a question that's sort of related to that, so I'm going to jump to that and I'll go back. But we have someone who wrote, there are some colleges that are encouraging students to fill out the FAFSA by January 15th. A lot of my students say that they're trying to fill out the FAFSA, but they're getting kicked out mid-application, and now they're worried that this would affect their acceptances. Are colleges pretty much anticipating these glitches? What advice could you share with our counselors and advisors working with students who are experiencing these difficulties?
I can take a stab at this one. So one of the things we did as an institution is we pushed back our priority date. Historically, we've used February 15th as our date. For this year, we're pushing it back to March 15th. And part of that is really, one of the reasons you try to get information is because you really want to be able to provide accurate financial aid information so students can make decisions. There are a number of schools that didn't choose to make their changes, and so some kept January 15th. There are some that have January 31st, which is on Wednesday. At our institution, we thought about who that would help and who that would hurt as far as an institution, and we chose to move ours back slightly. Part of the reasoning was when the FAFSA first launched, for an extended period of time, the first week, almost 2 weeks of January, the FAFSA was available for a few hours a day or 6 hours a day or from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And we didn't want families who were struggling with it or were getting kicked out of the process to really have some challenges. And I think each institution is approaching this slightly differently. And a lot of it has to do with who's applying to the institution and how to get the students in the door. So my first thing is to pay close attention to the dates from each school. My second thing would be don't panic about those dates, because even though some schools haven't pushed their dates, they are allowing FAFSAs to come in a little bit later. The main goal of a date is to get the FAFSA information in to send out an award package. Right now, we're on this platform where our institution probably won't get an award package out with FAFSA information until mid to late March. Other institutions have said late March or early April, and I think that could have a little bit of a domino impact on schools and ultimately that May 1st deadline. I know NACAC has been exploring that. They haven't made any decisions yet, but if schools are not sending out financial aid award packages until the first part of April, that really makes that time frame for May 1st difficult for schools or students to really make a decision by. So that's just me speculating. You know, the other main piece, I can't load FAFSA information because the department can't send them to me yet. So there's no reason for me to even have a deadline when I can't load a FAFSA. And that's sort of how and why we got to the March 15th date. Yep.
Thank you so much, Nick. I hope that helps some folks feel more reassured in how they're advising students and families. I did also just want to mention that we did a completing the FAFSA session last week, and we'll share some resources folder with you in the chat. So if you are interested in viewing that, you can view that. And we'll also, again, as a reminder, share this recording with everyone in case you want to come back and view it. So I just want to go back to the questions we had someone submit in regard to the FAFSA process. We're getting mixed messages for the parent contributors. If the parents are married and filing a FAFSA application as joint, do they each need to have a FSA ID or is it just one? And Taylor, I'll throw this one to you.
Yeah, thanks. I actually think, I'm not surprised to see this question come up. I think this was a commonly asked question by aid administrators when we were reviewing all of the information too. I think it still hangs us up. And so, Nick, hop in here if I go down a wrong path, but what we typically say is that if you're married and filing taxes jointly, you need one FSA ID, but parents have to still consent to the information, right? And so that can be rather confusing. We get that. But if it's married and jointly, it's one FSA ID because that tax return will contain both of those, individuals' tax responses.
Yeah, my follow-up would be our national association kind of went down this path, and their ultimate response was it sort of depends on the situation. And I'll share that one of my staff members was completing the FAFSA for her son. It asked for her information. They filed jointly together. And then it asked for the contact information of her spouse. According to all the training information that we had, that spouse should not have received a contributor email. And they entered the contact information, and that person was basically asked two questions. One, do they consent, and are they the person that are actually there? So it had no bearing on the FAFSA. Their FAFSA was actually processed before he completed that section. And so I think we are trying to work our way through this process as best we can and share the information and the scenarios that we're coming across. The FAFSA website does have kind of known issues. And this is one that I wouldn't call an issue, but it has popped up that people have had questions about. So in theory, in all the diagrams that have come out over the last 18 months, if the family filed jointly, only one contributor needs to sign the FAFSA and only one should be there. We have not seen that play out as designed in the workflow, and on occasion it asks for a second contributor. And on occasion, that second contributor doesn't even have to do anything. It's just asking for the second contributor. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's what we're dealing with.
Thank you, Nick. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to share a link for the FAFSA issue alerts. I think that might be a helpful page for counselors and advisors to have, which is a page on the Federal Student Aid website where they have a list of all the open issues and resolved issues. So maybe that could be a helpful resource. I'll go to the next question that we have here. And I'll ask this one to Taylor. Is there any scenario where both parents or contributors information has to be added in the finance section of the FAFSA?
Yeah, so this one is, I'll answer it in a couple of different ways because I just want to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. If you are, just like we talked about in the previous scenario, if the parents are married and file taxes jointly, both of their information should appear. If it's a split household, the FAFSA is going to ask the student and family to identify the primary contributor, right? Which is how the federal government is defining it as the most financial support within the past 12 months, right? And there's a really helpful decision tree, which Claudia, I hope is okay if I pop it into the chat.
Yes.
But this is basically a flowchart roadmap, however you want to refer to it, that will help students and families decipher who they put as the contributor on the FAFSA. You'll notice in the bottom left, there's a giant disclaimer about what Nick was just referring to in terms of the idea that some contributors will need to provide consent, and what that looks like may feel different for families. If a student is really struggling with who to put in, they can absolutely call one of the offices that they're working with if they've already had contact with us. If they're interested in Stony Brook, Nick's team would be able to take that call and help the students and families figure out who is best. But this guide should really be enough to help families get started in terms of who to list in there. Does that answer the question?
I think so. And if the person who asked, if you have a follow-up question, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can chat in a follow-up. Thank you, Taylor. The next question I see here is about parents living abroad. Nick, I'll throw this one to you, but it says, what advice do you have for parents who are living abroad? The parent was able to create their FSA ID, but now they cannot get past the signing screen. Contact verification.
Part of this could be maybe a little bit of timing. So this would be my take on this situation is when a parent creates a federal student aid ID, it takes a few days for the Department of Education to basically verify that federal student aid ID. And so when we've been doing this presentation over the last couple of months and we've been talking about the new FAFSA, one of the steps that we've been encouraging families to do is to go ahead and create their federal student aid ID so they can move through this process. If somebody's living abroad, then they have an FSA ID, then they would need to verify that information. It usually tells them at the time of setup for the federal student aid ID. Sometimes there's some extra questions to answer, or they may actually send some type of correspondence to the FSA ID recipient, basically to verify who they are. We have heard from students that have parents that maybe are non-US citizens and they're living abroad, that process has been a little bit cumbersome. My advice would be, one, wait a couple of days after that FSA ID, because it could come down to timing, and then try to sign the FAFSA at a later date. Or two, pay attention to the information from that FSA ID and see if the Department of Education may require any additional information from the parent to basically verify who they are. Those are kind of the two outcomes that would maybe solve this in most cases. There could also be some issues where there might just be a glitch on the day that you could sign it. We've also heard where there have been some issues where the parent can't sign their portion until the student actually signs theirs. And so maybe the student thought they signed their part, so I would encourage the student also to go out, make sure and confirm that their section is signed, then allow the parent to sign their section. Those are kind of the timing pieces. The other aspect is really making corrections to this, and I saw that question kind of pop in there. This kind of overlays on that. No corrections to the FAFSA can be processed until schools start receiving the FAFSA information. And part of that is the Department of Education processing the FAFSA information. And so in a podcast last week, our national association mentioned that there were a little over 3 million FAFSAs out there. All of those FAFSAs have to go out to the government agencies to verify student eligibility through Homeland Security, through the VA, and kind of a few other database matches. Once that process occurs, then we at schools will
Oh no. Did he freeze on your end too, Taylor? Okay. So I know we'll give Nick's computer and internet a minute to get it together, but we'll come back to the FAFSA corrections. In the meantime, I'm gonna skip down to another question, and Taylor, I will throw this one to you. It says, if a student lost their parent and or guardian and are in the process of establishing a guardian, what advice do you have for them for filling out the FAFSA?
Yeah, so this one's really tricky and it depends on what their like legal status is. And so if that was their only like living biological parent and they've now lost them, they would actually immediately be considered independent for federal aid purposes. There is a really great dependency questions. There's questions. So when students call our office and they say, I don't know if I'm dependent or dependent, we actually pull up this chart and go through question by question with them. And so this will help them decipher whether or not they're considered independent. But basically, the biggest ones for us are orphan or ward of the court. So they define orphan as no living biological or adoptive parent, ward of the court, or foster care. And so if your student that you're working with happen to fall in any of those categories, they would move through as independent. Okay. And so thank you for the clarification. So the federal government would say, if it's not like a court appointed documentation, that right now they would want that biological parent on the FAFSA. If that's not something that can happen, hopefully the legal process will kick in soon and they'll have identified a new guardian. And in that point, you could use that information, but the way it's defined federally is that that biological parent still living would become the parent of record for that student.
Thank you, Taylor. And I see that you shared a link as well that could be helpful for seeing the dependency status. And then I just want to go back up to this next question we have here. It says, with so many delays and glitches, some contributors are still unable to create their FSA IDs. Do you expect students to get financial aid packages with enough time before the May 1st date decision day? And I think
Yes,
Nick
so that
a little bit on that.
Yeah, it is a little bit tricky because here's what we'll say is like time is so we could send it out 3 days, and for some students and families that would be enough time before May 1 to be able to make a decision, right? So it's very subjective in terms of that. It also depends on how institutions are coping and trying to move through this process, right? So we have some schools who are not going to miss any time and still be able to get their aid offers out exactly when they expected it. Other schools are having a really hard time even telling families when to anticipate it because our work keeps getting moved back based on when the federal government is going to release those FAFSAs to us, which was what Nick was talking about before. And so the idea is that, you know, if your student that you're working with has 3 top schools, ask them to be in communication with those 3 schools of when they're looking at potentially sending out financial aid offers. You should probably expect them to hear that some schools aren't able to give a very clear, exact idea of when because it's still ambiguous for the school. We do know how important this is for families and students, just as aid administrators in general. And so we are preparing and working as hard as we can to make sure we can get that information to you as soon as we can. But this is still brand new to us, right? And so just like it opened to families in December and they were able to see the questions for the first time, we haven't seen a process 24-25 FAFSA yet, which is really crazy to think that we're coming so close to the May 1 decision deadline and we haven't seen it as schools ourselves. And so we'll work as hard as we can. We anticipate that the federal government knows the significant pressure that schools will be under and will work really hard to get it out as soon as they can. But we just can't guarantee how much time in advance those offers will start coming to you.
Thank you for that, Taylor. And Nick, welcome back. We have another question here about the CSS profile. So I'm going to throw this one to you, Nick. Can you tell us just what is a CSS profile and give some clarification? And Taylor, you can jump in if needed.
Taylor's a better expert on it, but I would give you my impression. CSS profile is a way that private institutions, primarily, and a couple of public institutions, try to collect a full financial aid eligibility or package of a family. So a lot of times it includes non-custodial parent, asset or net worth of maybe a home or things like that. And it's from schools that are really trying to take a look at the entire financial aid picture. That is my overall, that's like my 30,000 foot. Taylor can probably tell you why Mount Holyoke uses that.
Yeah, you got it, Nick. You're hired. Yeah, so we call it the CSS profile. It's a college scholarship service is what it stands for. The most easy way to explain it is it's the FAFSA on steroids. Like really, truly, it collects significantly more information than the FAFSA does, requires tax returns. Nick hit on the few key differences. The first is that it collects information from both biological parents, regardless of whether or not they're still married. So the CSS profile refers to it as the custodial parent, which is the parent of record that you're filing the FAFSA with, and then that non-custodial parent, which is the second biological parent. It also collects information on home values, business values, things like that. So Nick mentioned home value, that's considered an asset within the CSS profile. The overall goal here is intending that we receive so much information that we're able to better distribute our funds more equitably across our student populations because we're receiving more information. The biggest key here is that I will say when folks hear the word equal, they think they're going to get everything they need. I refer to it as equally unfair to everyone. I haven't had a family or student come up to me at Mount Holyoke and say, oh my gosh, Taylor, you got what I can contribute spot on. We feel perfectly comfortable doing that. It's just a way of our ability to collect as much as we can so that we can make sure we're comparing as close to apples as we can across those families.
Thank you so much. And Nick, I know earlier you were talking a little bit about the question that had came in about the FAFSA corrections. And so I don't know if we can jump back to that really quickly. Can students make corrections to their FAFSA?
Yeah, so I'm not sure where we froze in the process there. Students are able to make corrections to the FAFSA process as soon as the Department of Education starts processing them. So the early question was, when are schools going to get the information? Well, to get the information, we need to have a FAFSA out there. And then once that has been completely processed, then students can go in and start making corrections. So we'll let you know as soon as that is available. And I think Coalition and a lot of schools will be like, yes, we started receiving FAFSAs. If for students and or parents that have completed, that email should go out from the department. Should have got one that it was submitted and one will come when it's processed.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. There's another question here regarding parents who recently got married. And Taylor, I'll throw this one to you. How is income listed on the FAFSA if they were not living together in 2022?
Yeah, so the FAFSA will state that they want you to input the parent's marital status at the time that you're filling out the FAFSA, which means your parents would read as married. But it's obviously not going to be able to sync. And so what it's probably going to ask you for is because you filed the taxes separately, both parents will have to create an FSA ID and both will have to provide consent for that information to be brought into the FAFSA.
Got it. Thank you. There's another question here that I'll throw to you, Nick. It says, we have seen some parents that use an ITIN number, that use an ITIN number have been asking to verify identity by emailing FAFSA. They have been asked to attach an attestation and validation of identity doc and a copy of their ID. Is this common for ITIN users, or is there a way to avoid this step?
I think that's a great question. It's kind of like the one earlier that I answered about maybe the parents who are living abroad and verifying their information through the FSA ID. So the way it's been explained in all the diagrams, when you're creating an FSA ID, you are no longer required to have a social security number to complete that. In the past, there have been some parents or contributors, I guess we'll start calling them contributors, that have used their ITN numbers. In some ways, that should be an easier match through that FSA ID process. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. That's where the department has employed kind of an identity verification tool through TransUnion, which is one of the credit agencies. And I mentioned that about answering the questions. If people answer those incorrectly, or if the information isn't fully accurate, then the department will reach out and ask for that identity verification form to verify that that parent really is who they say that they are as a contributor for the process. And so is it common? I am not sure because we don't really have any stats on how many students and or contributors are being verified through that manner. But we have heard from a number of families that have gone down that path. Once we get some FAFSA information, schools may ask for some additional information along those lines. Taylor and I would say we're still not sure what information we may need to verify at a future date. And that's because nothing has been processed through, and I mentioned this earlier, through any of the other government agencies, Homeland, the VA, things like that. So there may be some additional clarification coming up in the future. The one thing that we are stressing with parents and contributors and counselors is that there may be some families that are maybe undocumented and staying here, and the Department of Education is not to share any of this identity verification with any other government agencies if that makes families or helps relieve some of those stresses.
Thank you for sharing that, Nick. Go ahead and feel free to add any questions that you may have. I'll go ahead and pose the question that came up in our session this past week, and perhaps maybe counselors or advisors may come across a situation like this. But what would happen, let's say, if there are parents who don't file taxes? Are they still eligible to submit a FAFSA and be eligible for financial aid? How should a counselor advise students who might be in that situation?
Taylor and I are kind of staring at each other on how to answer this. So Taylor and I in our careers have probably made a number of people file their tax returns that they have been unable or unwilling to do so. The FAFSA does require that you complete a tax return if you are required to file one. We do not anticipate that that would change at all. There is a verification process where this IRS data exchange, one, it brings in the data that the IRS has, and two, it looks to see if people have filed. So in the past, maybe we've asked families to verify that they weren't required to file. This also opens up a new door of verifying people who were not required to file a tax return or didn't file a tax return. And so we will go down that path with you and kind of explore that as we go along. But to be eligible for federal aid, you do need to file a tax return. And if you are required to file a tax return because your income is over a certain limit based on your household size, then you are still required to file a tax return, regardless of whether or not you want to do that. I think that's a nice way to say that. Is that good? I see Taylor laughing.
Awesome.
Yeah, I would agree. And so for us, it's if, you know, on record through federal law, you've earned enough where it says you have to file taxes, then you will hear from institutions that you have to file taxes in order to be eligible to receive federal aid. There's no way to like trick the system. And so that would come up for institutions. And so if you know a family who fits that description, it would be easier for everyone if they work to start that process before they reach us. We have to remember too that it's 2 years ago, not this most recent year. And so sometimes that catches us, but you know, you will absolutely hear families being asked from schools that they have to file their taxes in order to become eligible.
Thank you so much. There was another question that we had come in that I think it might be helpful to add some clarification on in this group. We had someone submit in our session that some people are sending their FAFSA form on paper. And if you could provide any sort of advice on whether families and students should submit their FAFSA paper and mail it. Is there information about how long it may take to process? And so any advice on that?
Please don't. That would be my advice. I think I would have a conversation with the family of why they really are going the paper route, with how unreliable this year is going in terms of processing. I think adding paper to the mix would slow down the process that much more. And so if that family's concerned about timing and cadence and how long they're going to have to make their decisions, paper would not be the way I would advise that family to go.
Thank you, Taylor. And I see we have about 9 minutes left for this session. My colleague Derek is going to be sharing the attendance form with folks, because I know there have been some people messaging me about that. So my colleague Derek will be sharing that with everyone. If you have any last minute sort of questions, feel free to add them into the chat. We probably have time for about 1 or 2 more. So I'll give folks a moment. My colleague Derek also shared the Google folder with the slide deck and other resources that we've included in there. So feel free to check that out. You should have access to that. And we're also going to be including this recording once it's available. So a little bit later today, we'll add this recording and you can view it again later if you would like to. We also have the mailing list if you would like to receive regular updates from the coalition, including any sort of resources. Feel free to join our mailing list. My colleague also included a link for that as well. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. But I do want to take a moment just to thank our wonderful panelists, Taylor and Nick. Thank you for spending your morning here with us and answering questions that counselors and advisors have. And for folks who submitted questions, thank you. If you have any more, again, we will share contact information in the resources folder. So know that you have that in case you want to follow up.
Thanks for everyone's time.
Thanks, Claudia.
Thank you.
May I ask a quick question? Sorry.
Of course.
So I had a Spanish speaking parent, right? And she was completing the FAFSA in Spanish, right? And of course, when it comes to the financial portion, I guess she was doing it from her mobile phone. So on the financial portion, it tells you look at line, blah, 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 on your 1040, subtract it or add it to this line. And then one of the questions had asked, or one of the financial portion was a line on 1040 and then line E. So when she went to the number on the 1040, there was something there, but since she didn't file a line E, so would she automatically put 0, or she would put what she saw on line 1040? Because it said subtract something from line 1040, which she found the number there. But then since there was no line E, she was confused as to, she couldn't subtract anything from line E because there was no line E. Would she put what she found on the line 1040? Because it was whatever she found on 1040 minus whatever was on line E, but there's no line E. So I was a bit confused on that portion itself.
Luna, was it asking her for Schedule E?
Yeah, for Schedule E. But she
Okay.
didn't have a Schedule E.
Okay. So if she didn't have one, so she was looking at our 1040, she didn't have a Schedule E. Was she able to use the link to the IRS? So she must have been in some filing status where it wasn't gonna let her do that. Is that accurate? So she was having to manually input it?
She was, I don't know, it was a bit confusing because you know what I did? I went, I told her, can you try to get it onto an actual computer or laptop to come in? And she said no. So what I did is I printed out the Spanish FAFSA, right? And I filled in basically what I was able to fill in, but that one was a bit confusing because I did find whatever line on 1040, there was like 4,000 something, but I couldn't subtract it from anything for Schedule E since she didn't have a Schedule E. So I don't know if she would put whatever she found in 1040, that number, because she couldn't subtract it from anything for Schedule E. So that was the only thing. I don't know why she was doing it manually, because I thought she could link her, once she puts her social, it would link it to the IRS, but for some reason for her, I don't know, it
Yes.
wasn't giving her
So
that
here's
option.
what I would say is, at some point, the IRS didn't do the data retrieval, which is why she had to manually enter it. So that is one piece that's sort of interesting. The Schedule E is really a report of income or loss from like real estate or transactions or like other income. So for some reason, it may be thought that she had that. If she didn't, you would report 0 because that's what a Schedule E is. So sometimes when we're verifying students, we'll ask for the Schedule E because that's income that doesn't come on a W-2, but that's usually reported like somewhere around like line 7 or so on the tax return. So is there anything on a Schedule E that shows up on the 1040 and then you would process it through? If she had nothing, then you would report a 0. I guess I would be more concerned that, you know, her native language doesn't really matter here. And the big piece is I'm more concerned that the information wasn't directly imported from the IRS and then she had to manually put it. But to answer your question, it would be a 0. There's nothing on a Schedule E.
Okay.
Can I add something to that? I experienced that with if something doesn't match up, whether they're married or unmarried, and then they file jointly, or then they're putting single. If something doesn't match up, I've seen where the information has to be inputted manually. So if something doesn't match up, it's gonna be a longer process. But if it matches evenly, nicely, I've experienced with a couple students, it's like seamless. So it's how the questions are answered by the student and then by the parent. Because sometimes the students put, oh, they're married, and then the parent will say, I'm single, I'm whatever, and then it doesn't match up to their how they file. So that was just what I saw. And I was surprised too, because I thought it was gonna take everything directly, but nope, if something doesn't align, you have to fill it out manually.
Good to know. Thank you for sharing. Okay, everyone. So we are going to wrap up the session, and thank you so much for joining us. You should have received the attendance link. And if you have any questions following the session, again, reach out to us at info@coalitionforcollege.org. And I will be following up as well with folks once we get registrant information. But I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you so much. Taylor, Nick, again, thank you.